Okay, then thank you everybody for joining my presentation today. I will talk about myself and introduce myself momentarily, but first I would like to ask you, if possible, to join my Slido. Let me try to put a link in the chat as well for easy joining, if at all possible. If I can manage to chat.
Could you explain what a Slido is?
Yeah, so Slido is a interactive, like audience interactive with presenter kind of app where you can answer questions or participate in polls or various interactive little either mini games or just like word clouds, etc. It'll allow me to interact with you while I'm presenting, but I still encourage you to even interrupt me, speak out loud if you have any questions. If you're more shy, feel free to put questions into Slido. I will answer them at certain points throughout the presentation. This kind of presentation, I really encourage you to ask specifically even about your research projects. Ask me if AI will work and specifically what you're working on, or if you're confused about anything. I will be more than happy to discuss it with you and answer your questions. I have put the link in the chat for those that do not want to open it on their phone or scan the QR or whatever. It's right there. Let me go back to that briefly. I'll give like 30 more seconds for people to join who wants to, and please do. Okay. And now, without further ado, let's briefly go over what we'll talk about in this presentation. If any of those topics do not interest you, you can plan out your pee breaks accordingly. I will first go over who I am and how we use AI in today's world, or where you may have seen it. I will then go over briefly what is AI, but it will not go too much in depth. This is specifically aimed at researchers that are not programmers. Then we'll go over the types of data you might be working with currently and the kind of problems we usually want to solve using this data and AI, and which algorithms we use in order to solve these problems. And then I'll briefly talk about how you can actually implement AI in your work as a non-programmer, and then some common mistakes to avoid in your next paper if you do indeed decide to use AI. So hello, my name is Tibor, and I am currently finishing master students at the Slovak Technical University of the Faculty of Information Technology, and I'm studying the Intelligent System degree. I'm a co-founder of MLTalks.online, which I will talk about a bit later. I'm a member of the Visions Graphics Group, which is an internationally active research group that uses AI in the field of medicine, biochem, and other fields. And I'm very passionate about AI and research in all natural fields, including biochemistry and all the different fields that are probably vast within this group of participants. But now I really want to figure out what those research interests are and what you actually do. So please look towards Slido and try to tell me, what do you do? What's your job, or what is your research? Try to use keywords. The more, the better. You can submit multiple responses. Okay. Biophysics, cell membranes. Okay. We have PhD students. That's fantastic. Computer modeling. That is great. Medicinal chemistry. Fantastic. Molecular biology. Fantastic. Honeybees. Now that is one I did not expect. Okay, so we have a pretty good spectrum of various fields and interests here. And I can tell you for certain that I've worked with Not all of these, but most of these in terms of AI. And I can tell you that AI is very applicable in most of these fields, which is fantastic. So this might be very useful to you. Okay, let us move on for now. This gives me a really good idea of who I'm presenting to. So what kind of AI is in today's world? And I'm sure you've heard most of these. Now you could probably name these in your head, but let's go from left to right. We have ChatGPT. I'm sure everybody heard about it by now. We have, of course, Google Assistant. We have Amazon, Alexa. Then maybe one you did not expect or didn't know. In Photoshop, there's plenty of AI technology used, and even in YouTube, there's AI everywhere used within the platform. And while some of these might seem very similar, like ChatGPT, Google Assistant, Alexa, they are actually very different in how they're used and how they're developed. ChatGPT is currently just been implemented into Microsoft Bing, the search engine, and it is a very vastly different system than, for instance, Google Assistant, which interacts with your direct Android system in order to provide you information, which is again different from Alexa, which can also provide you with information just like Google Assistant. But Alexa can also interact with various different vendors and suppliers, even order items for you, which neither Bing or ChatGPT or even Google Assistant can do. They cannot do this. Alexa has its own proprietary systems to do this. Then, of course, we have Photoshop, which is an image-based AI, which can, for instance, remove objects to make them invisible on the foreground. And finally, we have YouTube, which is actually the AI is used as a recommender system. As you might have heard of it as the algorithm recommending what videos you should watch. And we often know that it's not the best. But the point of the AI is to attract views, which it's doing really well. So the AI is successful in YouTube's eyes. So what actually is AI? AI is actually very many things, and you might be surprised as to how simple an AI can be. An AI can be as simple as a little monitoring device, a sensor, for instance, that monitors the outside humidity. And if it detects that the humidity is very low, it'll, for instance, water a plant. Even that can be considered an extremely basic AI. It can be a set of agents that simply take information from the outside and then enact some sort of action on the environment that they took the information from. The more common types of machine or AI is machine learning that you might have met with, and representation learning, and then even deep learning, which is the big boom nowadays, which is the most popular. One AIs that you might have met with but didn't know were actually considered AIs, for instance, linear regression. So if you ever worked with R or any other kind of software where you're trying to predict a trend in your data, that is considered machine learning or AI. Then there's logistic regression and classification problems where you're trying to, based on the data you have, predict if a data point belongs to one class or the other. That also then extends to multi-class classification, which has to be linearly separable in this case. That allows us to, again, classify data into multiple classes. And then we have the magical neural networks that you might have heard about that are a lot more difficult, but can handle a much bigger variety of problems. And I will show you and tell you why. But before we continue, I would first like to ask you, have you ever used AI before? I'm very curious as to how many of you actually encountered or used it before. Okay. Okay. That is actually a lot more than I usually tend to expect. So I'm actually very, very happy about this, that there's a good portion of you, about 33% of those that actually responded, that they've actually used more sophisticated machine learning algorithms or even neural networks. And I would love to discuss it with you at some point after the presentation during the QA session. But most of you have not yet used AI, or just use basic systems such as machine learning algorithms such as linear or logistic regression. And you will find that there is many machine learning algorithms that are very powerful and can most definitely help you in your work, because it's often very surprising to learn just how powerful AI can be to help you in your work and how many possibilities there exist. So to first understand where we stand with AI, there are different kinds of AI, and we generally regard like two general types. And here we have included a third one, but we generally include two general types, and that is the artificial narrow intelligence, which is a specialized kind of intelligence that is meant to tackle specific problems. So if you're trying to teach the AI to detect whether a picture contains a dog or a cat, that's a very specific problem. And this is most AIs that we use nowadays, even ChatGPT, which even though it knows information about a lot of topics, is not a general AI. It's very specific because it's learned a very specific data set and can only do one thing, and that is chat with you and answer your questions. It can't do anything else. The artificial general intelligence is the so-called future holy grail of artificial intelligence. That when we imagine artificial general intelligence, we are thinking of a intelligent system that is on the level of a human. It can do most things that humans can and can be applied to a very wide variety of different problems without having to retrain a new one on a specific concept or one problem. And then we have the artificial super intelligence. That's more sci-fi if you've ever watched Matrix, where the humanity is enslaved by the super AI that to which we are like ants. That's like the idea of the super intelligence. That's the level of like Skynet singularity sort of stuff, but that's mostly sci-fi. This should give you a good idea of what an artificial intelligence actually is. An artificial intelligence is basically some sort of computer system that attempts to replicate or simulate or come close to how a human mind learns in order to be able to do the same kind of actions we can based on that knowledge. And when we talk about the artificial narrow intelligence, which is going to be our main focus because that's the state of the art of today, we can mostly talk about three types, and that is the supervised learning algorithms, unsupervised learning algorithms, and reinforcement learning algorithms. We will, however, mostly focus on these two because those are the most relevant to your fields and your work. But even the third one is more useful, but that is a bit more complicated. The supervised learning, very simply, is you show the AI data in which you already know the answer, and then show it new kinds of data where you don't know the answer and hope it to learn to predict the answer. So for instance, if you know that the temperature for the past week has been, or if you were able to monitor the temperature over the past 7 days, you're going to try to ask the AI, what is going to be the temperature tomorrow? And you already know that answer. And first the AI attempts to guess the answer, and then you show it the real answer. And that's how it learns. It's being supervised because you're telling it if it's wrong or correct. Unsupervised learning, you have a lot of data that you don't know if there's any patterns yourself, or you don't know the answers to. And you expect the AI to be able to find these patterns on its own, which is entirely possible, by the way. And in order to better understand these two categories, we need to first look at what kinds of data we work with in science, or in data science specifically, or with AI, or the kind of data we can present to machine learning. Most commonly, you will have some sort of tabular data, as for instance on the top right, where you just have rows of information that can be, for instance, taught the AI. You can, for instance, teach the AI to predict whether a patient has diabetes based on various different information or biological data about the patient. Then you have, some of you might recognize the graphs on the top left, which is from flow cytometry, where you're trying to gate cells or not predict, but to determine which cells belong to a certain group when you're doing cell counting and whatnot. Then you have 3D MRE scans, which is very often used in medicine, and AI can actually find tumors in these 3D images. And yes, AI can actually accept any wide format of data. It is very flexible. And on the bottom right, you can see an image of cells from a microscopy image that have been marked with red dots. And this is actually from an AI counting or predicting what the cells might be. Here is another example, which is a cross-section of breast tissue where there is a breast cancer present. And we can ask the AI, where is there cancerous cells present in this image? And this is another example of a cross-section from lungs, from the epithelial tissue, where there's cilia in the lungs. And here we can also see that some of these look a bit worse than the others, less regular. And for instance, these images were used to teach an AI to predict whether there's a congenital disease present within the patient based on how many of these deformed cells exist within pictures of these cross sections. So now that you know a little bit about AI, what it can and cannot do, I want you to try to guess. I know you probably won't have too much of an idea if you never used AI before, but I just want you to try to guess how difficult each one of these problems are for AI to solve. Rank them from top to bottom, from hardest to easiest. They can be just complete guesses. Looking good so far. Okay, I think that's good then. Let's look at these. You were actually not that far off. These are pretty good guesses as a collective guess. So in the first spot, we have two things, but whether a patient has cancer based on a picture of the tissue. You've guessed that this is the hardest problem for an AI to solve, and you're absolutely right because the point of an AI is not to answer complicated questions of a whole system. It is only centered on very specific parts of a problem rather than a much bigger answer for a very complicated problem to which has only been given limited data. To ask an AI to say this patient has cancer just by showing him an image or it an image, it's not really possible and it shouldn't be attempted. AI is not meant to be a replacement for any kind of doctor or professional expert opinion. It's supposed to be a tool that helps experts or scientists find patterns in data or help answer simpler questions. For instance, to mark the portions in the tissue where there are cancerous cells. Then I'm surprised that many of you guessed this correct, that to predict whether a molecule is mutagenic. It is an extremely difficult problem because usually the kind of data we have available are simple chemistry pointers, various chemical indicators or descriptors, such as the molecular weight or other more complicated one like geometrical descriptors like Balban's J, etc. But these are usually extremely insufficient to determine how a molecular structure contributes to whether it is mutagenic or not. We have to use more complicated AI in order to be able to find this out. So it's quite a difficult problem. Finding tumors in a 3D MRI scan. Now, this one, actually, you'd be surprised, is actually a very simple problem. It's kind of unexpected usually, but finding tumors in a 3D MRI scan, if you have labeled datasets, as in you have datasets where it's already been marked by a doctor and then the AI learns from it, it's actually relatively simple for the AI to be able to do this. Predicting what type of cell is in the image, as you saw earlier with the black and white epithelial cells, it can be very difficult, especially if these cells are very similar to one another. So yeah, that is quite a difficult problem. And I was surprised that most of you put coloring tissue image based on its type on one of the easier problems. And you have no way of knowing this, but usually this involves a generative AI, where an AI is supposed to generate some sort of more complicated output like an image. And generally, this is a very difficult problem. Generating in general is a very difficult problem. And you correctly predicted that counting cells in an image or predicting that the temperature tomorrow is going to be something based on previous data, that is a relatively simple problem. Counting cells actually can be done with various methods that don't even need AI. So let us now continue on exploring what is the best approach with the different kinds of data and AI. So if you have tabular data, so like Excel sheets or CSVs or whatever, where you have rows, then it's best to first start with statistics. You'd be surprised, but most of the time you will not even need AI in order to find the kind of answers you're looking for. And this is called exploratory data analysis. And it's good to make as many useful graphs as you possibly can in order to thoroughly understand your problem and your data. So before you ever even think about AI, make sure you thoroughly understand your data and you know for a fact that the thing you're trying to find out cannot be found via simple graphs or statistics. If it indeed cannot, then we return to the two main categories, which is supervised and unsupervised learning, where you can figure out exactly what is it in your data that you're trying to find. Either you're trying to predict a class, for instance, how you mentioned earlier, whether a molecule is mutagenic or not. So it could be either A or 1, it is mutagenic, or B, 0, it is not mutagenic. That would be classification. Or you're maybe trying to fit a trend or find a trend in your data, which would be called a regression, where you're trying to find the next value or predict how the data points continue along a certain axis. Now we go on to unsupervised learning, where you actually don't know what you're trying to find, but you know there's relationships within the data. And this is usually done by clustering or association. So you know that there's some sort of a relationship in the data, but you don't know exactly how you can find it. You could, for instance, find if you have a tabular data of various students and their various grades, biographical data, or really anything that relates to that, you could find that it groups into two distinct groups based on, for instance, their learning disabilities. And you'll find that learning disabilities make the students' grades a lot worse. So what are the kind of AI algorithms we use mainly for tabular data? The most common machine learning approaches, and these are like the ones you should use the most often, and they're the most simple. And mind you, there are many different algorithms. There's about 100 different algorithms nowadays. But if you don't know where to begin, if you're new to this, I recommend these are the ones you use most commonly, because these are the ones that are most likely to succeed, depending on your data, of course, but these are the simplest ones to use. You have something called a random forest, or its neighbor, a little bit more advanced neighbor, XGBoost, where you simply create trees, they're basically decision trees, which you might have learned about at some point. And they use simple statistics in order to try to separate the data into various classes. Then you have super vector machines, which works on a simple principle of clustering or separating the classes. And finally, again, a sort of clustering algorithm called k-nearest neighbors. So if you don't know where to begin, these three algorithms are the most basic ones you might want to use. I would go a lot more into depth, but we don't really have the time about these. There's a lot of good materials you can find online as to how do these work in depth, but in my personal opinion, you do not really need to understand the math or how the algorithm actually works in order to be able to use it in your scientific work. Only when you are actually putting it and publishing it, you might want to have somebody explain them a little bit more in detail. But again, you do not need to know the exact math and algorithms behind it to use it. But then you may be thinking about what if I have much more advanced data? Like how do you shove a cat into a random forest, which usually accepts only like simple numbers, right? Like how do you shove a picture into a simple machine learning algorithm in order to determine its class? Or what if you have data that is extremely complex and scattered and there's no visible relationships between the data and the graphs that you might have made in order to analyze it? And here we actually encounter something called the problem of linear separability, because you can't really say what is the difference between a cat or a dog if you turn it into numbers. If you turn it into simple pixels, you see no relationship between the two and you can't really cleanly separate them. And that is because it really depends on context, how the object looks as a whole rather than the individual numbers. And I'll explain that in a bit more depth in just a second. But before we continue, I want to put in a little bit of an intermission for any questions that might have been asked in Slido, or if you have any questions right now. Let me see if there's any questions. No, there are no questions currently, but if you have any questions, feel free to ask now. And if not, we shall continue. And we are finally moving on to the more magical part of AI, which is artificial neural networks, which is the popular thing you might have heard about a lot and even read about a lot in various articles. So I'll try to explain in simple terms what a neural network actually is and what it does. A neural network basically tries to mimic how the human brain learns by trying to mimic the neurons in the brain, which are connected to each other and can somehow exchange information and learn from the information that passed through them. How we represent this in the computers is very simple. We have points of data, which is the x1 to xn, which is your inputs, right? So that can be your tabular data, for instance, age, blood pressure, etc. Now, every single one of these values has a weight associated with it. The weight means how important is this piece of data. Now, the weights at the beginning, they're random. We don't know what the weights are supposed to be. At the beginning, we just set them randomly. In order to get an output from this artificial neuron that we have represented, all we need to do is multiply the weight with the input piece of data and then add all the multiplied inputs with weights together and add something called a bias term. Then we just pass it through something called the activation function. Now, the activation function is simply a function that lets us transform it into a value, or yes, a value that we can somehow work with. For instance, the most simple type of activation function is called the step function. So for instance, if our neuron outputs something like 0.6, we can say that if it's above 0.5, then the patient has diabetes. If it's below 0.5, 0, then the patient doesn't have diabetes. That's the very most simple, but there's many different kinds of activation functions. And the reason why we use a bias term is because this neuron, in simple terms, represents a linear graph. And we use this linear graph to try to separate two clouds of data into two classes, for instance, patients with or without diabetes. And we cannot move the line anywhere but around the zero axis or around the 0 point, just rotating the line, unless we add a bias term, which is basically allowing us to move the line up and down over the graph. A deep neural network, which is a bit more advanced, a step up from a simple neuron, is when we start connecting those neurons together. The principle still works exactly the same. It's still the exact same math. But now we're connecting every output of a neuron to the input of every other neuron in the next layer. So where you see the x1, x2, xn, those are basically the output of a neuron from the previous layer, and they connect to every single one on the next layer. But the math works exactly the same. This is every single one of those dots on this picture. And why we call it a deep neural network is because it usually has many of these layers in between, which are called hidden layers. So many neurons in between the input and the output. Now I'm going to try to very simply explain or give you an example of how a neural network would work if we just had two input neurons, two on the hidden layer and one on the output layer. In order to understand this, we have to understand that in order to understand how the neural network learns, we have to first understand what a cost function is. A cost function helps the neural network learn. It is a function that helps us determine how correct or incorrect a neural network is, and is usually on the output neuron. So for instance, if the neural network predicts that, let's say we have a neural network that's trying to predict whether some person is a female or male, just based on their height and age, which is of course a difficult problem, but there is a correlation. So for instance, the neural network would predict, or on the output, we would have 0.6. Because you have to understand the output of a neural network is always some kind of probability. And if we have 0.6 on the output, it means it's more likely that it's a female by this designation where male is 0 and female is 1. Now, how do we tell how wrong the neural network is in order for it to improve? One simple cost function that is able to do this is called binary cross entropy, which is used for binary problems like this. And the math here is very simple. Where you see the px on the bottom, that is the target, meaning that is the true piece of information, the true class. So if we know, in fact, it is a female, and the neural network predicted 0.6, you can see that we would plug in 1 in the left part of the equation, which is 1 times, so that basically has no effect. And then we have logarithm of the qx, which is the output of the neural network, which is 0.6. So basically, we're doing logarithm of 0.6. And on the right side, if instead it was actually supposed to be 0 and we predicted 0.6, the left term would cancel out because px would be 0, so the left term completely cancels out. And the right term, again, would be just logarithm of 1 minus 0.6. So we just basically cancel out different parts of the equation here in order to determine which part is important to tell the network how wrong it is. And if you actually look at the graph of these two parts, of the left and right part of the equation, you can see that the more incorrect the neural network is, the higher the value of the line becomes, up to 2. And this basically tells the neural network how much it needs to improve, because all that a neural network is simply a machine that tries to minimize the value of the cost function. It's just a big minimization problem, a global optimization problem, which you might have learned in math. So really what we're doing is every time a neural network predicts some sort of class or value, based on how wrong it is, and now this is a bit complicated as to how these how the weights, because what we're doing is we're updating the weights in a neural network in order to minimize the cost function. And how this happens is actually quite complicated, and it's a lot of calculus, and I don't want to scare you off with that, so I'm not going to go too deeply into it. But basically, it is the derivative of the cost function in respect to the weights and the activation functions of the neurons with those weights. We're trying to determine how much a weight contributed to the error of the cost function. And then we reduce this contribution on the weight so that we minimize the error that is being inflicted upon the output value. And when we do this one step at a time, every time we predict something, we try to force the neural network to learn. We're basically minimizing the amount of error that it's making until some global minimum. And that's how a neural network basically learns. And the reason why we use neural networks for many problems is because many problems are actually linearly inseparable. Meaning, if you have two clouds of points, two different classes in the data, like you see in the picture on the right, there's no clean way in order to draw lines in order to separate them into class A and class B. It's impossible. But neural networks, because of the activation functions, which make them nonlinear, can find ways to very, very efficiently separate two classes of very intermingled and complicated data into two classes. They can learn extremely complicated gradients and lines and various shapes to specifically separate them. I really encourage you to go to the website that's in the linked by the QR code on the left. It is a simple playground which lets you add neurons in order to able to separate two different classes of data, and you'll see that it manages even extremely complicated data. It is a quite bit of a fun tool, and I can only recommend a bit of advice. The reason why we use deep neural networks is because deeper neural networks are usually better. The deeper, usually, the better, but also that makes it more complex computationally. To give an example of how, for instance, a neural network can be used for predicting some sort of class from image data, here on the left, you can see we have a handwritten number 6 numeral. And how we could construct a neural network is by simply putting 784 pixels on the left, which are the input neurons, and assign each one of those pixels to each one of those neurons in a row. And on the output, this is a very simple neural network with no hidden layers, only input and output layers. We have 10 output neurons, which predict whether the number is 0, 1, 2, etc., up to 9, which we are basically predicting the class. And actually, this kind of neural network would work. It wouldn't be too good, but it would work. However, what if we get to much more complicated pictures, such as cats or dogs, and we're trying to predict whether it is a cat or dog indeed from the picture? Normal images, like photos, are significantly more complex because we have actually 3 channels and a 2-dimensional pixel grid. So if we had a 4x4 image, that's 4 times 4 times 3 pixels. And those are usually extremely related and statistically intertwined. So it's very difficult for the neural network to understand that the 3 channels are somehow related. So let's take this image of a puppy, which has 1000 by 1000 pixels and has 3 RGB channels. Try to figure out it yourself. It's already on the bottom, but if you were to try to figure out on yourself how many neurons on the input we actually need in order to shove this whole picture into a neural network, you would come out to the value 3 million, because we need 1000 by 1000 by 3 neurons to put all pixels one by one into the neural network, which is a huge amount. If the second layer had only 1024 neurons, we would need 6 gigabytes of memory to be able to keep that huge neural network. And the average laptop has anywhere from 8 to 16. So usually basic neural networks do not work for images. But there's a special kind of neural network, and this is the kind you will most likely use in your research if you work with cytometry or histopathological images, which are called convolutional neural networks. You might have heard about convolution as an operation in some of your classes, but potentially. And the operation of convolution is simply taking a square patch, a matrix of numbers, and let's say this input on our left is an image. The pink square is our convolutional kernel or a filter, and you multiply each one of the pixels with the corresponding pixel of the filter. So it would be 1 times 1, 0 times 2, 1 times 3, 0 times 4, etc. And then you add all of those together, the products, to get the final result. That is called a convolutional operation. For instance, the most commonly used convolutional operation is using something called a Gaussian kernel or Gaussian filter, where if you apply this operation to an image, you will basically blur it. It's an averaging filter, and it's used very commonly. And this exactly applies in neural networks as well. In neural networks, instead of having fixed filters with specific numbers that you're multiplying with, each one of those numbers of the kernel of the filter of this pink square is actually a weight, the same weight we saw earlier over here. So the weights weight 1, weight 2, etc. Those would be the numbers inside of the pink square here. And on the end, where you're adding them together, that is the neuron. You're adding the weights of the pink square together and then passing them through an activation function, and that represents a neuron. And each one of those squares, and you could have many of them, you can have 32 of those squares moving over an image to produce some sort of output. And these are, for example, these are the output images in a convolutional neural network where the weights have already been adjusted and learned some sort of features. And you can see that the leftmost side, which is the topmost features, or the very first convolutional filters or kernels, they learn, for instance, edges or shapes or patterns or very basic colors. And the deeper you go, the more convolutional layers you add on top of each other, the more complex features it learns. As you can see in the last or the higher level features, it starts to learn the shape of wheels and the various different shapes of a car if we're using a convolutional neural network to predict what kind of a car it is or what color it is, etc. And that's exactly how a convolutional neural network works. We have some sort of input image, and then we have filters, which are our neurons, and that produces new sets of images based on this convolutional operation. And we keep adding on top of each other more and more of these layers to learn higher and higher level features. And on the end, we just convert this image into a row of pixels like we did with the numbers and pass it into a very simple neural network to get some sort of prediction or classification, just like before. The pooling operation is simply a way to reduce the size of an image after certain points. But you will learn that if you look deeper into learning convolutional neural networks in terms of AI. So based on this, we actually have 4 different kinds of problems or tasks a convolutional neural network can do. The very simple one is classification. For instance, we're trying to figure out whether the picture contains a dog or a cat. Then we have semantic segmentation, where you're trying to have the neural network predict what the types of objects in the image are. You're trying to have the AI predict that this specific pixel or set of pixels belong to a certain class. Then we have object detection, which try to specifically find independent objects in the image. So if you have multiple dogs, it'll be able to detect that there are dogs in various spots in the image. And finally, you have instance segmentation, which is the same as the second problem, but you're trying to mark the areas in which these objects exist in the image. And these are basically from easiest to hardest in terms of complexity. And semantic segmentation can usually be done as an unsupervised problem. So you don't actually need a labeled data set to be able to do this, which is very useful if you're trying to, for instance, detect cancerous cells in histopathological images. Now, I'll give you some examples of neural networks and their applications, ones that I've probably even used in my work. For instance, in this one, this is from the publication we worked on, which is the quantitative assessment of ciliary ultrastructures with the use of automatic analysis. We've developed a software which is able to look at the cilia in the epithelial tissue of the lungs, the cross sections, and be able to predict what class a cilia belongs to, if it's normal or if it's damaged. And based on this, a doctor then can evaluate these results and say whether a patient has the congenital disease associated with it. It serves both as a cell counter and also is able to find all the different classes of the cilia in the image. Another project was MLTalks, which is one I'm currently working on, which actually this is one of the harder problems. It's trying to predict whether a molecule is phototoxic or mutagenic. The mutagenic molecules we're still working on. It's a very difficult problem, but the tool is already able to predict whether a molecule is phototoxic or not. And we've actually surpassed Sanofi in terms of the quality of the results. And they have worked on a similar problem, over 90% accuracy. Here you can see, for instance, a result of a prediction, which this is the acridin molecule. And you can see that the AI predicted with 100% certainty that acridin is indeed phototoxic. Of course, there are many other different applications. For instance, this one where you're able to not only detect parts of the tissue that might be somehow infected or where stroma might exist, and then also be able to classify it, what class it belongs to. This is a project that many of my colleagues in my university are working on currently. And there's even, and this is a much more difficult problem where we're trying to convert tissues from one color to another or normalize tissue colors to help doctors be able to better work with the tissue and perform diagnosis. But now we get into the most important part, and that is how can you, as a researcher, as somebody who has never ever touched AI before, how can you use it in your research? The most straightforward answer, but one that most of you will not like, is to simply sit down and start learning Python and look at the TensorFlow documentation. TensorFlow is a tool, a Python library that lets you create neural networks. And they have a fantastic documentation and a whole course that teaches you how to use them. And I want to really encourage you to go this way, because with this you'll be able to achieve the best results and have complete control over the work that you're doing. And let me put your mind at ease a little. Python is a very, very, very simple language. And you usually don't need to know how to program in it very well in order to be able to start making neural networks or using various different machine learning algorithms. There's many good documentations, and usually, even myself from experience, I can tell you when I was learning this, it's mostly copy paste. You don't even have to understand what you're doing. It just usually works. However, if you don't want to learn how to program, which is probably most of you, or at least some of you, there's very good tools called, for instance, Microsoft Azure AutoML. You can look at Microsoft Azure, where they have a sophisticated tool that lets you automatically, this is mainly for tabular data, but it lets you automatically process your tabular data and create or propose machine learning networks or methods that might work best with your data to produce the results that you want. And you don't have to write a single line of code. This is entirely automatic with only minimal input from you. There's also PyCaret, which is a simplification for Python even, that lets you again create simple machine learning networks, neural networks, or use various different algorithms to be able to use on your data, and handles most of the heavy lifting for you, so you don't have to learn most of the more complicated stuff. And I'm going to tell you already, if you ever consider learning neural networks, you do not need to know all the complicated stuff such as backpropagation, which is the algorithm by which a neural network learns. All of that is mostly useless to you unless you're a computer scientist. And one other thing I want to say is if you have problems ever figuring out how to use AI in your work or are interested in using AI in your work but don't know where to start, you're always free to reach out to me. This is my personal mail, or any of our fantastic doctoral students in my faculty, because all of them are very eager to work with other universities and other PhD students on various different problems. Currently, we're actually working with 2 universities and 3 hospitals to provide various different solutions to their problems. We work very fast and are always very eager to accept new problems. And there's always students that are willing to immediately jump on the problem and work with you actively to solve it. And finally, if you do manage to convince yourself, or if you do start using AI in your work, which I highly encourage because it can be used absolutely everywhere, how do you avoid more common mistakes I've seen myself in most scientific papers with people new to AI trying to use it in their work? First of all, it's very important to describe your data in depth when you're using AI, because there are a lot of people who want to understand how your AI works and whether it is suitable for the data you used. And if you're using a simple neural network in your paper that only uses a couple hidden layers, an input and an output layer, usually you don't need it. Usually you want to use simpler machine learning algorithms such as random forest that I mentioned earlier for your problem. Always when you're using a very basic neural network, you usually don't need to use it. Whenever you do use a neural network, make sure to thoroughly describe your architecture and method in depth, or have somebody more experienced in the problem do that for you. This includes various hyperparameters and settings of the neural network. And most importantly, don't forget to include various parameters of your dataset, such as the training test ratio, and make sure to provide various results of your neural network and analyze them with statistics. AI does not replace proper statistical evaluation, and you always have to do this to validate your results. That is pretty much everything that I have had prepared in my presentation, and I will be very happy to discuss with you any questions you might have had. And there are actually a couple questions here, so let's see and try to answer them. How do you determine the size of image patch in CNN? Because the bigger the matrix, the more data you lose or miss. I misunderstand. Keeps the hidden data. So when it comes to patch size in CNN, to explain those that don't know what that means, usually you don't want to feed huge images to a neural network, even a convolutional neural network, because it takes a lot of memory in your computer. So if you have a huge image, let's say 10,000 by 10,000 pixels, which is not uncommon in various histopathological data and cytometry, you want to separate into smaller patches that you then show to the neural network one at a time. The best way to determine the size of the image patch is you have to ask yourself if the image patch size you've chosen sufficiently covers the context which you're trying to teach to the AI. So for instance, if you are trying to teach it to find cells and classify the cells in an image, you want to make sure that your image patch is large enough that it manages to see whole cells. You never want your image patch to be small enough that, for instance, where there are cells that are much bigger than your image patch. You usually want to be able to have multiple cells in one patch, so the AI has a lot more information to work with. Okay. I hope that answers the question, but please feel welcome to follow up that question. We can discuss it further. What kind of analysis, supervised or unsupervised, would be the best to find a function in a complicated plot, like yearly temperature changes? In this case, That really depends on what kind of data you're working, or what's your objective. But if you're just trying to find the yearly temperature changes, you would best to use a unsupervised method, and there are many unsupervised methods that are actually even simpler than AI. For instance, in signal processing or even data processing, you have autocorrelation. Like I mentioned earlier, before you use AI, it's best to first consider simpler methods and statistics. And in this case, like trying to find yearly temperature changes, autocorrelation, for instance, works really well because it lets you see the trend in the data. But if you really wanted to use AI, there are various regression unsupervised methods that let you see patterns or repetition in the data. Now, how do you know that your data are good and clean enough to serve as a reference point to learn from neural network? How do you prepare the data to be useful? There is never really a way to tell if it's clean enough. That's pretty much impossible. You can always only say good enough, and it will always reflect on the results from the neural network. If you see that your neural network is not learning well, you can always try to data engineer the data to be better, to extract different kinds of information or extract the information better. There's never really a way to tell it's clean enough, but as a good start, you definitely want to make sure that you don't have any text in there, for instance, but obviously that wouldn't even work. But you want to make sure that your data is represented cleanly and well, and that it's not strongly correlated. A good rule of thumb is when you're analyzing your data statistically, you want to make sure that there are no correlated columns or different data types, or not types, the different contents of the data. Because correlation between three different columns, for instance, can cause the neural network to be confused and perform less well. So that's really the most important thing. But then, of course, there are different methods such as dimensionality reduction, which is a bit more complicated of a topic, but it also works well to improve the degree that the neural network can learn from your data. But it's really hard to always tell if it's good enough. It can always be improved. You do really need to just use the results from the neural network to then further improve your data. And this is actually called something called the CRISP-DM model. And that's the kind of model as data scientists use to work on these kind of AI-driven problems where we have a data, we try to use AI, we see if it works well or not. If we see it doesn't work well, we go back, we start studying the data again and start cleaning it again and start reformatting it again, data engineering again, and we just repeat this over and over until the neural network is good enough. Now, how do hospitals and other public facilities get convinced to use AI to help doctors? You know, a few years ago in Epsilon, it was impossible. That's a bit of a complicated question, but usually we have to reach out to the hospitals and have connections within these hospitals or universities, or you know, these are usually university hospitals that we usually reach out to that have actually PhD students working on difficult problems. We always try to tell them that we are not replacing you. The AI is not meant to replace you. And this is usually what people are worried about. The machine is going to replace me. That is never going to be the case. AI is there to help doctors and humans perform better, give them the tools to be able to perform their diagnoses better. It is not there to replace them. It is not there to perform the diagnosis for you. The patient always has to know, and the doctor always has to know. He always has the last word, and he is the most important person in the room. The AI is only a tool. It's a piece of software that helps you make your diagnoses faster and better. And that's usually what we have to stress to doctors in order for them to understand really why it is okay for them to accept AI into their daily work and accept the help of AI. Convince them that this is something that they do want rather than don't want. I do not know like in how it works in Poland and what is the general consensus about AI in Poland, but I'd be happy to talk about that. or learn more about that because we have not worked with somebody from Poland yet. That was the last question, but I'm still open to many more questions if anybody wants to ask anything, and I'm also open to open discussion.